to turn to you with the microphones in just a moment, but I'd like to actually turn to the panel for brief comments on a reversal that is taking place, the stay by the Supreme Court on our carbon policies. Do you have comments on that? How is it being received in Beijing? Broader reflections from Noelle and John, if you want to add.
Start off by saying that in the negotiations leading up to the U.S.-China agreement, one of the greatest concerns in Beijing was actually, can the U.S. politically implement what they've signed up to do? And this is the first sign, and I think strong ammunition for those in Beijing who say the pledge was potentially disingenuous. I think it was not, certainly on the part of the negotiators. It was a huge milestone and a major advance over what had been accomplished previously and between the two nations. But at this point, I think this gives real pause to the Chinese assessment in particular.
So I think from a global perspective, you're really looking at one of the cornerstones of this system where you have this pledge system is trust. And the trust that came around to actually build this system was not negligible. And what this does is starts to erode that trust in other countries being able to fulfill their commitments as a prerequisite for you fulfilling yours. And that's really the only thing we can really build the international system on, particularly for environmental agreements. I think what it says to me is that we ought to be thinking much more locally in terms of climate policy, that we're not going to be looking at one solution. We're going to be looking at 190 solutions, and it's going to really matter particular stakeholders in particular countries and particular interests. I mean, we're looking at one or two members of the Supreme Court types of stakeholders in the United States, but the United States isn't everything. This is going to happen in other countries, and we're really going to need sort of an all-hands effort. Thinking as a next step, and this is something that could come up in discussion, about other ways to motivate climate action and interests that you can bring on board might be a potential way forward.
So I already commented a little bit, but let me add, I agree completely with the local accumulating to more global action. This is, of course, consistent with Lynn Ostrom's principles for how to manage a common pool resource, and I think we're already seeing a lot of that, and it's a good reason to be optimistic. Meanwhile, the stay is procedural, but it certainly does not bode well for the Clean Power Plan, and it's already undermining trust, and many of the other nations have already said, look, if the U.S. isn't going to follow through on its INDC, why the hell should we? So this is already happening now, even before there's a decision. And even if the plan is ultimately upheld, it will have created uncertainty and delay. Now let's be clear, this is absolutely a political issue where vested interests are using the system. I think you could potentially make a principled argument about executive overreach, but the number of amicus briefs that have been filed in opposition to the Clean Power Plan by the fossil industry, those people are not filing these briefs because they're concerned with the fine points of our constitutional system. They are defending their vested interests at the expense of everybody else. It's absolutely political, as you saw in the 5-4 vote. But even more important, however that decision ultimately goes, the United States is not going to be able to meet its INDC in a world of $1.70 a gallon gasoline and $30 oil and depressed prices for natural gas and coal. We already see people buying bigger and less efficient cars. We already see wind, solar, and other renewables being suppressed by the low natural gas prices. We already see people saying, why the heck should I put better windows or insulation in my house when my gas bill just fell by half compared to 2 years ago? So the headwind, the rocks in the pack, and the mountain. We've got to focus on taking away the subsidies, undermining the vested interests, and pricing carbon. And now is the perfect time to do it when energy prices are so low. Let's get that carbon price.
Driving back from New Jersey, Christmas Day, the day after Christmas, $2.29 a gallon. And I have to tell you, my thinking was this is the time to put a $1-a-gallon gas tax on, at least to kick things off in the direction of encouraging conservation. But it's not going to happen.
Well, so never say that, right?
No, it's not going to happen until John mobilizes support.
Well, so you know what happens when 1,000 MIT students and faculty, and I didn't make this up, I learned it from my students, march in Washington, and our leader says, "What do we want?" You know what we all say? "What do we want? We want evidence-based policy. When do we want it? After peer review." That's not going to do it, folks. Now, I'm in favor of science and evidence-based policy and peer review, but that's not going to do it.
This is the perfect segue to questions and answers and comments. And what I'm going to do is pull an Oprah and carry this around. If you can identify yourself quickly and ask.
I'm Valerie, former negotiator on behalf of Brazil and currently at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I have two questions, and they are action. First, due to the Supreme Court's decision, I would like to know if the states here in the U.S., they could exercise leadership on the Clean Power Plan even without the regulation. And secondly, on the low oil prices, isn't it time for a tax on oil, and how likely is that to happen?
Her mic doesn't speak.
Okay, who wants to take on these two questions? And I'm going to kind of position for the next question as well.
I can take that on the states. There is absolutely leadership at the state level. That's sort of how, I mean, that really created the conditions by which we could get the Clean Power Plan in the first place. And there's certainly states who are arguing, you know, it was some states that challenged the Clean Power Plan, but there's a whole coalition of states that are not challenging. And the question is, you know, in the absence of coordinated national action, how far can we get? But there's certainly a long history in the U.S. of using states as laboratories for innovation, and a lot of states that are really moving forward on climate action. We have goals in Massachusetts. There are very ambitious goals in California as well, and in a number of other states.
I can speak to the gas tax issue because I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times some years ago that makes precisely the point that we do need a tax on gasoline, I think, as a substitute for, if not a complement to, other policies that we have in place to deal with the externalities associated with using oil in transportation. So I think that the main reason, I absolutely agree with you. I would love to see a tax on gasoline. I just want to use an anecdote from the response I got to that op-ed, which laid out an argument for why that was not only the most cost-effective, but also potentially much more palatable from a distributional perspective, because this is a policy where you're generating revenues, you're potentially able to fix roads, you're potentially able to offset the worst impacts on those families that use the most gasoline. But I think what really was telling for me, so I wrote this op-ed and I got a call from an irate person who said, you know, you're in your ivory tower, I bet you don't own a car, I bet you walk to work, I really feel like you just don't understand, you know, me and the people I represent who, you know, drive 30 miles to work every day. Again, I mean, my response to that, and I think this is also telling, so there are two things. I actually, and he left his number. He said, but you won't call me because you're too busy in your ivory tower. And I said, look, I'm going to call this guy back from an unlisted number. I picked up the phone, and turns out that I learned in that conversation that this was someone who was actually hired by a consortium of medium and small businesses who are going to be very hurt by a higher gasoline tax. So this was someone who was essentially astroturfing, posing as a grassroots individual who was actually trying to influence me and others who write towards these causes. And then the other thing, by the end of the conversation, I had actually convinced him that a gasoline tax was a good idea, that it might, and he said, look, I really, and this is, I think, the point, he said, I really appreciate the fact that you took the time to call me and explain your argument to me. It means a lot, because it's not very common that people in your position reach out and talk to people in my position. And so I think that's a message to all of us, that we can actually make this climate change action something that's that's inclusive, that's popular, that's interesting, that's fun, that doesn't have to be a huge burden, and at least we can articulate our arguments in a way that connects with people, and I think that makes a big difference.
So I actually want to recommend that Valerie go and have this conversation with Donald Trump and Senator.
So don't publish your cell phone numbers, so be careful.
And also using John Sturman's number to make the call from.
Why I go into such abuse? Can I make a really fast comment? The thing about the price of gasoline is it's $1.73 where I live at the pump, but the real cost, the real price is probably around $8 a gallon, and that is a real cost that people really pay. They pay for it in healthcare, they pay for it in congestion, lost time, accidents, and all kinds of other harms, wholly aside from the climate damage. All a carbon price would do is put the correct true price in front of people so they can make wise decisions. And all the revenue from that would come back to people, and we would be better off. Essentially, every study of this shows people would be better off in their own narrow, self-defined way under a price for carbon than without it, because you're paying it now.
Okay, we have a question in the back.
Hi, my name is Leo from the Sloan and MIT here as well. And I want your opinion on the debate of the whole fare equality reduction. I think there was a paper at MIT last year in which it discussed if all the countries were to cut, should they all have in the end the same kind of emission per capita, or should some people cut more than others? Is that being discussed? Is that being used as a concept in the agreement?
Give that to Susan.
That's your choice.
So I think it's a great idea, and but on the other hand, we're thinking about an international system, right? So from an international negotiations perspective, it's a complete non-starter. You're basically starting with one pie, and you're saying the only way that you're going to gain more part of the pie is if I lose. So from just a negotiations theory perspective, it's kind of starting with a framework that you don't allow any win-wins. And this is really a problem when you're trying to get 190 sovereign states to agree to something. From a scientific perspective, it makes total sense. But trying to structure an international negotiation around it would be really difficult.
Let's move over to, actually, a couple front rows. Okay.
Hi, I'm Kurt Newton. I work for Office of Digital Learning here at MIT. I had a question about the degree to which the Paris Agreement treats global trade fairly relative to the way we're going to be carving things up on a country-by-country basis. With the amount of outsourcing of manufacturing, for instance, is it treating fairly the way that a country can feel like we've reduced our emissions because they're not taking into account the manufacturing impact that they're having, which is realized in other countries?
I can speak to that. So I guess there are sort of two concepts that are important here. One is territorial emissions, which are the emissions that are essentially produced inside a country's own borders, and then there are those that are embodied in trade. So if I'm in a country, say I'm in the US, and I'm also consuming goods that were produced in places distant from where I'm located, but where the emissions are part of another country's territorial emissions. And so that's the concept we're talking about here. And it's really important. So in the case of China, fully 20% of China's emissions are actually due to consumption outside of China. So China, of course, has been known for a long time as the center of manufacturing or important part of global supply chains. And so I think it's really important to think about these issues. And there are a lot of discussions around how do you penalize, for example, or how do you, I guess, another important concept here is leakage. So if the U.S. puts a policy in place, it's likely that some of not just the dirty capital, but also activities will move outside of the U.S. and then the pollution will increase elsewhere. And we're already, I think, seeing that in the case of China, where they're cracking down on overcapacity in coal. So some of it's really overcapacity, but part of the problem is really